The autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and desperation across the makeshift camp outside Independence, Missouri. Canvas-covered wagons formed a rough circle in the muddy field, their wooden wheels caked with the red clay that would soon become all too familiar to the families preparing for the treacherous journey west. Children's laughter mixed with the lowing of oxen and the sharp crack of whips as men tested their equipment one final time. But in the center of it all stood three broken souls that nobody seemed to notice. A wagon train leader whose calloused hands shook as he clutched a bottle of whiskey. Twin newborns wrapped in a tattered quilt whose cries had grown weak from hunger. And a well-dressed woman whose empty arms ached with a loss that had haunted her for 7 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Daniel Harrison adjusted his weathered hat and squinted against the October sun, his blue eyes scanning the chaos of the wagon train assembly with the practiced gaze of a man who had led 4 successful expeditions to California. At 35, he commanded respect through quiet competence rather than bluster, his tall frame moving with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions for dozens of families. Today should have been like any other. Departure day, final inspections, last-minute adjustments to loads, and the careful orchestration of moving 200 people and their possessions across 2,000 miles of unforgiving wilderness. Instead, Daniel found himself standing outside the weathered tent that had become both nursery and tomb, staring at 2 tiny faces that belonged to children he couldn't bear to look at and couldn't bring himself to abandon. The twins had been born 3 days ago during the worst thunderstorm Missouri had seen in a decade. Lightning had split the sky as his wife Catherine screamed through 18 hours of labor, her auburn hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and rain that leaked through their tent's canvas walls. Dr. William Peterson, the expedition's physician, had done everything he could with the limited supplies available, but Catherine's body had been weakened by months of hard travel and poor nutrition. She had lived just long enough to hold each baby once, her green eyes bright with fever as she whispered their names, Thomas, after your grandfather, and Elizabeth, after mine. Then she had looked at Daniel with an expression he would carry to his grave, not accusation or anger, but a kind of weary sadness that seemed to encompass all the dreams they would never share. Take care of them, Danny, she had whispered, using the nickname she'd called him since their wedding day 12 years ago. Promise me they'll know they were wanted. He had promised, of course. What else could a dying woman's husband do? But in the 3 days since Catherine's burial in the Missouri clay, Daniel had come to understand the impossible weight of that vow. The wagon train was scheduled to depart at dawn, and caring for infant twins while leading an expedition through Indian Territory, river crossings, and mountain passes was beyond any man's capabilities. The other families had their own children to worry about, their own survival to ensure. Martha Wellington, whose husband commanded the advance scouts, had offered to help with feeding, but she already had 4 children under the age of 10 and couldn't take on the full-time care that newborns required. Dr. Peterson had suggested finding a wet nurse in Independence, but the town's respectable women weren't interested in joining a dangerous westward journey to care for motherless babies. That left Daniel with options that twisted his stomach into knots. He could abandon the expedition, stay in Missouri, and try to raise the twins alone, but his reputation and livelihood depended on successfully leading wagon trains west. He could take the babies along and hope for the best, knowing that their cries would attract hostile attention and their needs would compromise his ability to keep everyone else safe. Or he could make the choice that felt like betrayal but might be their only chance at survival. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his dark thoughts. Samuel Morrison, the train's assistant leader and Daniel's closest friend, emerged from between 2 wagons with his characteristic purposeful stride. At 42, Samuel had the graying temples and steady demeanor of a man who'd seen enough of the world to understand its harsh realities. "The Hendersons are asking about departure time," Samuel said quietly, his brown eyes studying Daniel's haggard face. "Folks are getting anxious. Weather's turning, and if we don't leave soon, we'll be racing winter to the mountains." Daniel nodded, without really hearing. He'd been giving the same answer for 3 days. Soon. Just need to settle a few things. But the truth was, he had no idea how to settle anything. Every solution felt like abandoning Catherine's memory or condemning their children to an uncertain fate. "Danny," Samuel's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who'd earned the right to speak plainly. "You can't keep putting this off. Those babies need more than you can give them on the trail, and these families need a leader who isn't torn in half by grief." "I know," Daniel replied, his voice hoarse from 3 days of minimal sleep and constant internal argument. "I know what I have to do. I just ... Catherine made me promise." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then placed a weathered hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Catherine was a good woman, but she was dying and afraid. She couldn't have known what you'd be facing out here. Sometimes keeping a promise means finding a different way to honor it." Before Daniel could respond, a commotion erupted near the supply wagons. Raised voices carried across the camp, and both men turned to see a crowd gathering around what appeared to be an argument between 2 of the expedition's members. Daniel straightened his shoulders and walked toward the disturbance, grateful for any distraction from his impossible situation. The crowd had formed around James Mitchell, a burly blacksmith from St. Louis, and a well-dressed woman Daniel didn't immediately recognize. Mitchell was red-faced and gesticulating wildly, while the woman stood with her arms crossed, her expression calm but unmistakably determined. "I paid good money for passage on this train," Mitchell was saying, his voice carrying the edge of a man accustomed to getting his way through volume and intimidation. "I didn't pay to be delayed while our so-called leader sorts out his personal problems." The woman, who Daniel now realized must be Eleanor Phillips, the widow who joined the expedition at the last minute, turned slightly toward Mitchell with the kind of controlled grace that spoke of good breeding and careful education. She was perhaps 30 years old, with chestnut hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a traveling dress that, while practical, clearly came from an expensive dressmaker. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying a soft Virginia accent, "I hardly think 3 days constitutes an unreasonable delay, particularly given the tragic circumstances." Mitchell snorted dismissively. "Tragic or not, this is a business arrangement. Harrison should have planned better, found someone to take those babies before we were scheduled to leave. Now we're all paying the price for his poor judgment." Daniel felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. The man was right, of course, which only made the words sting worse. He had failed to plan, failed to anticipate, failed to protect his family or the expedition he'd contracted to lead. "That's enough, Mitchell," Daniel said, stepping forward, with enough authority to make the crowd step back slightly. "The delay is my responsibility, and I'll resolve it today." Mitchell opened his mouth to argue further, but Eleanor Phillips spoke first. "Captain Harrison, might I have a word with you privately?" There was something in her tone, not pity or judgment, but a kind of quiet urgency that caught Daniel's attention. He nodded and gestured toward a relatively isolated spot near the creek that ran along the camp's eastern edge. "Eleanor." Phillips walked beside him in silence until they were out of earshot of the wagons. Then she stopped and turned to face him directly, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I understand you're facing a difficult decision regarding your children," she said without preamble. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's a private matter, Mrs. Phillips." "Miss Phillips," she corrected gently. "And yes, ordinarily it would be. But I couldn't help overhearing some of the conversations around camp. People are talking about orphanages or finding families willing to take in foundlings. The blunt words hit Daniel like physical blows. He'd tried not to think about what would actually happen to Thomas and Elizabeth if he left them behind in Independence. Orphanages in frontier towns were often little more than warehouses for unwanted children, and finding good families willing to adopt twins would be nearly impossible. "Miss Phillips," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please let me finish. I have a proposition that might benefit everyone involved." Eleanor took a deep breath, and Daniel noticed her hands trembling slightly despite her composed demeanor. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "I've been married twice, Captain Harrison. Both husbands were good men who wanted children as much as I did. We tried for 7 years with my first husband before he died of pneumonia. 3 years with my second before consumption took him as well. I've seen every doctor from Richmond to Chicago, spent more money than I care to calculate, and prayed until my knees wore holes in every rug I owned." She paused, looking out over the muddy creek where a few children were playing despite their mother's warnings about getting dirty before the journey began. "I'm 31 years old, Captain, and I've accepted that I will never bear children of my own. But that doesn't mean I've stopped wanting to be a mother." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a tiny flicker of possibility in the darkness that had consumed him for 3 days. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Let me adopt your children. Legally, formally, with proper papers drawn up by a lawyer. I have the means to care for them. My second husband left me quite comfortable financially. I have experience with children from helping raise my sister's family. And I'm already committed to this journey west, so you wouldn't be separating them from the only parent they have left." The offer was so unexpected, so precisely suited to his impossible situation, that Daniel found himself suspicious of its convenience. Why would you want to take on that responsibility? Infant twins require constant care, and the trail ahead is dangerous. Eleanor's smile was sad but genuine. "Because those babies represent something I've wanted my entire adult life. Because raising them would give meaning to a journey I'm only taking. Because I have nowhere else to go. And because ... She hesitated, then continued with quiet conviction. "Because I believe God sometimes arranges circumstances that seem tragic, so that people who need each other can find one another." Daniel studied her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Instead, he saw something that reminded him painfully of Catherine in her more hopeful moments, a woman who had endured loss, but hadn't allowed it to destroy her capacity for love. "The trail is brutal," he said, testing her resolve. "We'll face river crossings where people drown, disease that kills healthy adults in days, and hostile tribes that won't distinguish between combatants and children. Are you prepared for that?" "Reality? I've read every account of Western travel I could find," Eleanor replied steadily. "I know the risks. But I also know that hundreds of families make this journey successfully every year, and many of them travel with small children. With proper preparation and care, your twins can survive the crossing just as well as any other child on this train." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of crying drifted from the direction of his tent. Elizabeth probably, demanding the feeding that was already overdue. The practical demands of caring for the twins had consumed every moment since Catherine's death, leaving him exhausted and increasingly desperate. "I need to ... He began, gesturing toward the tent. "May I come with you?" Eleanor asked. "I'd like to meet them properly." Against his better judgment, Daniel found himself nodding. They walked back through the camp in silence, past families making final preparations for departure, past the supply wagons where Mitchell continued to grumble about delays, past Dr. Peterson's wagon where the smell of carbolic acid and camphor hinted at the medical challenges that lay ahead, the tent that had sheltered Daniel and Catherine for 6 months of travel now felt like a mausoleum. Catherine's dresses still hung from hooks along the canvas walls, and her small vanity mirror reflected the morning light onto the quilt where the twins lay crying. Thomas, the larger of the two, had kicked off his blanket and was making the angry, red-faced demands of a healthy newborn. Elizabeth, smaller and frailer, cried with less energy but more desperation. Eleanor stepped into the tent behind Daniel and immediately moved toward the babies with the confident movements of someone accustomed to caring for children. She lifted Elizabeth first, cradling the tiny girl against her shoulder and beginning a gentle swaying motion that gradually quieted the crying. "Hello, little one," she murmured, her voice taking on the instinctive crooning tone that seemed to be universal among women with maternal instincts. "You're hungry, aren't you? And probably tired of lying in that same spot all morning." Daniel watched in amazement as Eleanor somehow managed to soothe both twins simultaneously, holding Elizabeth while keeping one hand free to stroke Thomas's forehead until his cries subsided to whimpers. There was something almost magical about her touch, a natural competence that Daniel had been trying desperately to develop for 3 days without success. "They're beautiful," Eleanor said, looking up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "They have your bone structure, but I can see their mother in Elizabeth's chin and Thomas's eyebrows." The observation hit Daniel unexpectedly hard. He'd been so focused on the overwhelming responsibility of keeping the babies alive that he'd barely allowed himself to really look at them, to see Catherine's features emerging in their tiny faces. "She wanted them so much," he said quietly. "We've been trying for years, and when she finally conceived, she was so happy. She spent hours talking to them before they were born, telling them about California and the life we were going to build there." Eleanor nodded understanding. What were her plans? What kind of life did she envision for them? Daniel found himself talking about Catherine's dreams, her hope that they could start a school in one of the new California towns, her determination that their children would have opportunities that hadn't existed for previous generations, her belief that the Western Territories represented a chance to build something better than what they were leaving behind. "She made me promise they'd know they were wanted," he concluded, the words coming out rough with suppressed emotion. "Then that's exactly what I'll make sure they know," Eleanor said firmly. "Every day of their lives, they'll know that they were conceived in love, born to parents who treasured them, and chosen by someone who sees them as the greatest blessing she could ever receive." Something in her voice, absolute conviction mixed with desperate hope, convinced Daniel that she meant every word. This wasn't charity or convenience. This was a woman who had found something she'd been searching for her entire life. "There would need to be legal arrangements," he said slowly, hardly believing he was considering the possibility. "Proper adoption papers, financial provisions for their care. I have money, Captain Harrison. More than enough to provide for them well into adulthood. And I want this to be completely legal and binding. I'm not interested in temporary guardianship or informal arrangements. I want to be their mother in every sense of the word." Daniel looked at the twins, now resting peacefully in Eleanor's competent arms, and felt something ease in his chest for the first time since Catherine's death. The crushing weight of impossible choices was lifting, replaced by the first glimmer of hope he'd experienced in days. "The train needs to leave tomorrow morning," he said. "Is that enough time to arrange everything properly?" Eleanor smiled, and, for the first time since meeting her, Daniel saw genuine joy replace the careful composure she'd maintained. "Captain Harrison, I've been waiting 7 years for this opportunity. I'll have everything arranged by sunset today." As if summoned by their conversation, Samuel Morrison appeared at the tent opening. "Danny, we need to ... oh." He paused, taking in the scene of Eleanor holding both babies with obvious competence. "I didn't realize you had company." "Samuel, meet Miss Eleanor Phillips," Daniel said, feeling lighter than he had in months. "She's going to adopt Thomas and Elizabeth." Samuel's eyebrows rose, but his expression quickly shifted to relief. "Well, that's wonderful news, for everyone involved." He paused, studying Eleanor with the careful assessment of a man. responsible for the safety of an entire wagon train. Miss Phillips, are you certain you understand what you're taking on? Mr. Morrison, I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying absolute conviction. These children need a mother, and I need to be their mother. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem is simpler than we think. Outside the tent, the sounds of the wagon train continued. Families packing their final belongings, men checking harnesses and wagon wheels, children playing games that would soon be impossible during the long days of travel. But inside the small canvas space, 3 adults and 2 babies had found something none of them had expected. The beginning of a family forged not by blood or convenience, but by desperate need and impossible hope. The twins had stopped crying. Entirely now, resting peacefully in Eleanor's arms, as if they somehow understood that their uncertain future had suddenly become something worth anticipating. Daniel looked at the woman who was offering to take on the greatest responsibility he could imagine, and for the first time since Catherine's death, he allowed himself to believe that keeping his promise might actually be possible. Tomorrow they would begin the long journey west, carrying not just their possessions and dreams, but the fragile beginning of something that might, with time and care and determination, grow into exactly the kind of family Catherine had always envisioned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Independence Courthouse steps as Eleanor Phillips clutched a leather satchel containing more legal documents than she'd ever signed in her life. Beside her, Daniel Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his best suit, the formal clothes feeling foreign after months of trail wear. In the nearby hotel room, Martha Wellington watched over Thomas and Elizabeth, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, unaware that their entire future was being decided. In the mahogany-paneled office of Judge Harold Blackwood, Eleanor had worked through the night to arrange everything. Her late husband's attorney, Benjamin Crawford, had connections throughout Missouri's legal system, and a combination of generous donations and urgent telegrams had produced the necessary paperwork with unprecedented speed. Now as they waited, in the judge's chambers, Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of anticipation and terror. "Miss Phillips," Judge Blackwood began, his weathered face stern beneath bushy white eyebrows, "I must say this is highly irregular. Adoption proceedings typically take months, not hours. Are you absolutely certain you've considered all the implications of this decision?" Eleanor straightened in her chair, drawing upon the poise her Virginia finishing school had drilled into her decades ago. "Your Honor, I've spent 7 years considering the implications of becoming a mother. The only thing irregular about this situation is the timing, not my commitment." Judge Blackwood turned his attention to Daniel, his expression skeptical. "Captain Harrison, I understand you're facing difficult circumstances, but signing away parental rights is permanent. Once these papers are filed, Thomas and Elizabeth Phillips will no longer be your children in the eyes of the law. Are you prepared for that reality?" Daniel's hands tightened on his hat brim, and Eleanor watched him struggle with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his composure. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but rough with suppressed grief. "Your Honor, my wife made me promise that our children would know they were wanted. Keeping that promise means ensuring they have a mother who can provide the love and care they deserve. Miss Phillips can give them what I cannot." The judge made several notes, then pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. For the next hour, Eleanor and Daniel navigated a maze of signatures, witnesses, and legal terminology that transformed 2 grieving strangers into a family bound by law rather than blood. Eleanor's hands trembled as she signed her new name, Eleanor Phillips, legal mother to Thomas Daniel Phillips and Elizabeth Catherine Phillips, while Daniel formally relinquished all parental claims to the children he would continue to protect as their wagon train leader. The final document established a trust fund for the twins' education and future needs. funded entirely by Eleanor's inheritance. Judge Blackwood raised his eyebrows at the substantial amount, but Eleanor had insisted on providing more than adequate financial security. These children would never want for anything she could provide. When the last signature was witnessed and notarized, Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair with an expression of cautious approval. "Well, this is certainly the most unusual adoption I've ever processed, but everything appears to be in order. Miss Phillips, you are now the legal guardian and adoptive mother of Thomas and Elizabeth Phillips. Captain Harrison, you've fulfilled your legal obligations while ensuring your children's welfare. I wish you all safe travels." Outside the courthouse, Eleanor and Daniel stood in awkward silence, both struggling to process what had just occurred. In the space of 12 hours, Eleanor had acquired the family she'd dreamed of for years, while Daniel had made the most difficult decision of his life. The legal documents in Eleanor's satchel represented both tremendous hope and devastating loss. "We should return to the hotel," Daniel said finally. "The wagon train needs to depart within the hour, and there are still preparations to make." The walk back through Independence's dusty streets gave Eleanor her first glimpse of the practical challenges ahead. Other members of the wagon train were loading final supplies, checking harnesses and saying goodbye to friends and family who would remain behind. Children ran between the wagons in final games before the long journey began, their laughter a stark contrast to the serious expressions of the adults who understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. At the hotel, Martha Wellington met them with a mixture of relief and concern. She'd managed to feed both babies and change their makeshift diapers, but her experience with 4 children of her own was evident in her efficiency. "They're good babies," Martha reported, handing Elizabeth to Eleanor with practiced ease. "Elizabeth is the fussier of the two, but she settles quickly once she's fed. Thomas seems content to sleep between feedings, though he's got quite a grip when he decides he wants attention." Eleanor cradled Elizabeth against her shoulder, marveling at the solid warmth of the tiny body and the sweet scent of baby skin. For 7 years, she'd imagined this moment, holding her own child, feeling the complete trust of a helpless infant. The reality was both exactly what she'd dreamed and utterly overwhelming. "What supplies will they need for the trail?" Eleanor asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite her emotional state. Martha and Daniel exchanged glances, and Eleanor realized there were countless details about infant care during a grueling cross-country journey that she hadn't considered. Martha began listing necessities: extra blankets for cold mountain nights, special foods for when the babies began eating solids, medicines for the inevitable childhood illnesses, and most critically, arrangements for feeding during the weeks ahead. "I've been nursing them since Catherine died," Martha explained delicately, "but I'll need help if this arrangement is going to work. My own baby is only 6 months old, and nursing 3 infants will be difficult." Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment at her own ignorance. In her excitement about finally becoming a mother, she'd focused on the legal and emotional aspects while overlooking practical necessities that could mean the difference between life and death on the trail. "What other options do we have?" she asked, determined to find solutions rather than dwelling on problems. "There's a woman named Rebecca Foster traveling with the Jameson family," Daniel offered. "She lost her own baby 2 weeks ago and might be willing to help with nursing. Dr. Peterson also has some experience with feeding infants when nursing isn't available, though it's not ideal." The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation that gave Eleanor a stark introduction to the realities of frontier motherhood. Martha helped her pack a specialized trunk with baby supplies, while Daniel arranged for modifications to Eleanor's wagon that would provide better protection for the infants during river crossings and storms. Dr. William Peterson, a dignified man in his 50s with the calm competence of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions with limited resources, examined both babies thoroughly and pronounced them healthy but warned of the challenges ahead. Infants are vulnerable to temperature extremes, dehydration, and diseases that adults can survive. He explained to Eleanor with professional directness. You'll need to watch them constantly for signs of illness, keep them warm and dry no matter what conditions we face, and be prepared to make difficult decisions if medical emergencies arise. Eleanor nodded solemnly, understanding that Dr. Peterson was preparing her for the possibility that not every member of their wagon train would survive the journey ahead. The romantic notions she'd harbored about Western travel were quickly being replaced by a realistic understanding of the dangers they would face. As the wagon train finally began to move, Eleanor found herself seated in her modified wagon with Thomas and Elizabeth, sleeping in a specially constructed crib that Samuel Morrison had built to minimize jostling during travel. Through the canvas opening, she could see Daniel riding alongside the lead wagons, his military bearing evident as he coordinated the complex logistics of moving 200 people and their possessions across the Missouri countryside. The first day of travel revealed challenges Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The wagon's constant motion made caring for the babies difficult, and the noise of creaking wheels, lowing oxen, and shouting drivers created a chaotic environment that seemed to agitate the infants. By afternoon, both twins were crying almost constantly, their distress adding to Eleanor's growing anxiety about her decision. Martha Wellington rode alongside Eleanor's wagon when possible, offering advice and encouragement, but her own responsibilities to her family limited the help she could provide. Other women in the train offered sympathy, but little practical assistance, their own children and household management consuming all available energy. The real test came that evening when the wagon train made its first camp along the banks of the Blue River. Eleanor struggled to establish a routine for feeding, changing, and settling the babies while also managing her own basic needs. The simple task of heating water for washing diapers became a complex logistical challenge when multiplied by all the other demands of trail life. Rebecca Foster, the young woman who had recently lost her own child, approached Eleanor's campfire. As darkness fell, she was perhaps 25, with the pale complexion and hollow eyes of someone still deep in grief, but her offer of help was genuine. "Mrs. Phillips," she said quietly, "I understand you might need assistance with the babies. I still have milk, and it seems wrong to let it go to waste when these little ones need care." Eleanor felt tears of gratitude spring to her eyes. "Miss Foster, I would be deeply grateful for any help you can provide. I'm still learning so much about caring for them." What followed was Eleanor's first lesson in the collaborative nature of frontier survival. Rebecca took over the nighttime feeding of Elizabeth, while Eleanor managed Thomas, and other women in the camp contributed knowledge, supplies, and occasional assistance that made the enormous task of caring for twins slightly more manageable. Daniel stopped by Eleanor's campfire before making his evening rounds, his expression concerned as he watched her struggle with the practical realities of her new role. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, but genuine concern for both Eleanor and the babies. Eleanor looked down at Thomas, who had finally settled into peaceful sleep in her arms, then across the fire at Rebecca, gently rocking Elizabeth. The day had been exhausting and overwhelming, filled with moments when she'd questioned her ability to provide adequate care. But holding Thomas, feeling his tiny hand grip her finger with complete trust, Eleanor knew she'd made the right choice. "No second thoughts," she said firmly. "Just a steep learning curve. I knew this wouldn't be easy, Captain Harrison. I just didn't realize how much I didn't know about the practical aspects of motherhood." Daniel nodded, his expression softening slightly. Catherine went through the same thing when her sister's children visited. She said motherhood was like learning to speak a foreign language while someone's life depended on your fluency. The comparison was apt, Eleanor realized. Every cry, every facial expression, every change in the baby's behavior was a communication she was still learning to interpret. But like any language, fluency would come with practice and patience. As the campfire burned low and the wagon train settled into the vigilant quiet of its first night on the trail, Eleanor made final preparations for what she knew would be a challenging night. The babies would wake every few hours for feeding, and the unfamiliar environment would likely make them restless. But she was no longer facing these challenges alone. Rebecca had agreed to sleep near Eleanor's wagon to help with nighttime care. Martha had promised to check on them during her own early morning routine, and even Dr. Peterson had stopped by to leave a supply of medicines that might be needed for infant ailments. Most importantly, Eleanor had begun to understand that successful motherhood on the frontier wasn't about individual competence, but about building a network of support that could sustain families through the countless challenges ahead. The twins weren't just her responsibility now. They had become the responsibility of an entire community of people committed to ensuring that the most vulnerable members of their group survived and thrived. As she settled Thomas and Elizabeth in their traveling crib and prepared for her first night as their legal mother, Eleanor felt a deep sense of rightness about her decision. The day had been difficult, but it had also been filled with moments of pure joy. Elizabeth's tiny smile during feeding, Thomas's contented sighs as he fell asleep, and the growing sense that she was finally fulfilling the purpose she'd been searching for her entire adult life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they traveled deeper into the wilderness. But tonight Eleanor Phillips was exactly where she belonged, watching over two precious children who were now, in every sense that mattered, her own. The third week of October brought with it the kind of relentless rain that turned the Kansas prairie into a treacherous bog of mud and standing water. Eleanor pulled her oilskin cloak tighter around herself as she peered through the wagon's canvas opening, watching the endless procession of boots, hooves, and wheels struggling through ankle-deep mire that seemed determined to swallow their entire expedition. Inside the wagon, Thomas and Elizabeth fussed constantly, their usual sleeping patterns disrupted by the damp cold that seeped through every layer of protection Eleanor had managed to construct. Despite her best efforts with extra blankets and heated stones wrapped in cloth, the baby's tiny hands remained perpetually cold, and their breathing had developed a concerning rattle that made Dr. Peterson frown each time he examined them. "We need to find shelter soon," Rebecca Foster said quietly, adjusting her position as she attempted to nurse Elizabeth. The young woman had become Eleanor's closest ally over the past 2 weeks, her natural maternal instincts compensating for Eleanor's inexperience with infant care. "This dampness isn't good for any of us, but it's especially dangerous for the babies." Eleanor nodded grimly, watching through the wagon cover as Daniel rode past on his enormous bay gelding, his cavalry coat streaming water as he shouted orders to the struggling teamsters. The wagon train had been making barely 5 miles a day since the rains began, and tempers were growing short as families dealt with soaked clothing, spoiled food, and the constant threat of disease that accompanied such conditions. The crisis Eleanor had been dreading finally arrived on a Thursday morning when Thomas woke with a fever that frightened her more than anything she'd experienced since leaving Independence. His tiny body felt burning hot against her palm, and his breathing was labored in a way that reminded Eleanor terrifyingly of her second husband's final days with consumption. "Dr. Peterson," she called out frantically, not caring who heard the desperation in her voice. "Please, I need help." Dr. Peterson arrived within minutes, his medical bag already in hand and his expression serious as he examined the listless infant. Eleanor watched his weathered face for any sign of reassurance, but found only the careful neutrality of a physician who had delivered too much bad news to too many families. "It's pneumonia," he said finally, his voice gentle but direct. The constant dampness and cold have overwhelmed his little body's ability to fight off infection. Elizabeth shows early signs as well, though she's not as advanced. Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. What can we do? There must be something, medicine, treatment, anything. Dr. Peterson was already preparing a mixture of herbs and camphor. His movements efficient, despite the wagon's constant swaying. "We'll do everything possible, but I need you to understand the reality we're facing. Infants die from pneumonia even under the best circumstances, and these are far from ideal conditions." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows, but she forced herself to focus on what could be controlled rather than what couldn't. "Tell me what to do. I'll do anything." What followed were the longest 48 hours of Eleanor's life. She and Rebecca took turns maintaining constant vigil over both babies, using steam from heated water to help their breathing, administering Dr. Peterson's medicines with desperate precision, and monitoring every change in their condition with the intensity of soldiers watching for enemy movement. Daniel appeared at Eleanor's wagon several times each day, his usual commanding presence subdued by helplessness in the face of his biological children's illness. Eleanor watched him struggle with the impossible position of being responsible for the entire wagon train's safety while wanting to focus all his attention on Thomas and Elizabeth. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked on the second night, his voice hoarse from shouting orders through the continuing rain. "Any way I can help?" Eleanor looked up from where she sat holding Thomas, whose fever had broken that afternoon, but who remained dangerously weak. Elizabeth lay nearby in Rebecca's arms, her breathing still labored, but slightly improved from the previous day. "You're already helping," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "By keeping this train moving, by making the decisions I can't make because I'm focused on them. This is what we agreed to, Captain Harrison. You lead the expedition, and I care for the children." Daniel's expression revealed his internal struggle between duty and paternal instinct, but Eleanor saw the moment he accepted her words and found peace with the arrangement they'd made. "They're strong children," he said quietly. "They have Catherine's determination and stubbornness. They'll fight through this." He was right. By the fourth day, both babies showed significant improvement, their fevers breaking and their breathing becoming less labored. Dr. Peterson pronounced them past the worst danger, though he warned that full recovery would take weeks, and that they would remain vulnerable to further illness. The crisis had revealed something important about the wagon train's social dynamics. While some families had maintained careful distance from Eleanor and the babies, whether from fear of contagion or disapproval of the unconventional adoption, others had stepped forward with practical support that proved invaluable. Martha Wellington had organized a rotation of women to help with cooking and laundry, while Eleanor focused on nursing care. Samuel Morrison had personally ensured that Eleanor's wagon received priority placement in the daily lineup, protecting it from the worst of the trail's jarring impacts. Even James Mitchell, who had complained so bitterly about delays, had quietly donated extra firewood to keep the babies warm, but it was the emergence of an unlikely ally that surprised Eleanor most. Mary Chun, the 18-year-old daughter of Chinese immigrants who had joined the wagon train as cooks for one of the larger families, appeared at Eleanor's wagon on the fifth day carrying a steaming bowl of unfamiliar but aromatic soup. "My grandmother's recipe," Mary explained in careful English, her dark eyes shy but determined. "Good for babies who are sick. My mother, she make for all my little brothers and sisters when they have the lung sickness." Eleanor accepted the soup gratefully, tasting the complex blend of ginger, herbs, and bone broth that seemed designed specifically for recovery from illness. When she offered it to Thomas on a tiny spoon, he accepted it eagerly, the first real interest in food he'd shown since falling ill. "This is wonderful," Eleanor told Mary sincerely. "Would you be willing to teach me how to make it?" Mary's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. "You want to learn Chinese cooking?" "I want to learn anything that will help keep them healthy," Eleanor replied firmly. "Will you show me?" What began as a practical arrangement quickly developed into something more meaningful. Mary proved to have extensive knowledge of herbal remedies and infant care techniques that complemented Dr. Peterson's more traditional medical approach. Her family's experience with keeping children healthy during difficult travel conditions provided Eleanor with invaluable insights into nutrition, hygiene, and disease prevention. More importantly, Mary's presence helped bridge cultural divides within the wagon train that Eleanor hadn't fully recognized before. The Chun family had faced suspicion and hostility from some members of the expedition, their different language and customs making them targets for the kind of fear that often emerged under stressful conditions. By accepting Mary's help and publicly demonstrating respect for her knowledge, Eleanor found herself taking a stand on issues larger than infant care. When Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife from St. Louis, made disparaging comments about foreign influences around the children, Eleanor's response was swift and decisive. "Mary Chun has probably saved my children's lives with her knowledge of healing," Eleanor stated clearly, her Virginia accent carrying the authority of someone accustomed to social leadership. "I consider myself fortunate to have her guidance, and anyone who questions her expertise is welcome to care for sick infants themselves, using only traditional methods." The confrontation established Eleanor's position within the wagon train's social hierarchy while also protecting Mary's family from further hostility. Eleanor realized she was using social skills developed in Virginia drawing rooms to navigate frontier politics, adapting her background in ways she'd never anticipated. As the weather finally began to clear and the wagon train resumed its steady westward progress, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed since that first day in Independence. The legal mother who had signed adoption papers with trembling hands had been replaced by someone who could make life-or-death medical decisions with calm competence. The babies, too, had changed. Thomas had developed into a robust infant whose easy smile charmed everyone he encountered, while Elizabeth revealed a more serious temperament that reminded Eleanor of her own childhood intensity. Both children had begun to show clear recognition of Eleanor's voice and touch, responding to her presence with the kind of contentment that spoke of genuine attachment. Perhaps most significantly, Eleanor had found her place within the complex social ecosystem of the wagon train. No longer an outsider tentatively seeking acceptance, she had become a respected member of the community whose opinions carried weight and whose expertise was valued. The evening after the babies were declared fully recovered, Daniel stopped by Eleanor's campfire carrying a bottle of brandy that Samuel Morrison had been saving for special occasions. Rebecca was teaching Mary how to mend the specialized baby clothes that Eleanor had purchased in Independence, while Eleanor herself worked on correspondence she planned to mail from the next town they reached. "I wanted to thank you," Daniel said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee Eleanor offered, "for everything you've done, but especially for how you handled the crisis. Catherine would have been proud of the mother you've become." Eleanor felt tears threaten at the unexpected praise, but managed to keep her voice steady. "I had help. More help than I ever expected from people I barely knew 3 weeks ago." "That's what makes this work," Daniel replied, gesturing toward the circle of wagons where families were settling into their evening routines. "Not individual strength, but the willingness to support each other when support is needed most." As if to underscore his point, Elizabeth chose that moment to wake from her nap and immediately begin the demanding cries that indicated hunger. Without hesitation, Rebecca set aside her mending and reached for the baby, settling into the practiced rhythm of feeding while continuing her conversation with Mary about herbal remedies. Eleanor watched the easy cooperation between the 3 women and marveled at how naturally they had formed a partnership that benefited everyone involved. Mary gained respect and protection from association with Eleanor's social position. Rebecca found purpose and healing in caring for children after losing her own, and Eleanor received the practical knowledge and emotional support that made successful motherhood possible. Looking around the campfire at the faces of people who had become her chosen family, Eleanor felt a deep sense of satisfaction had nothing to do with reaching California and everything to do with finding her place in the world. The twins slept peacefully nearby, healthy and content, surrounded by people who had chosen to love and protect them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they moved deeper into territory where hostile tribes and dangerous river crossings awaited. But Eleanor no longer faced those challenges as an isolated individual trying to prove her worthiness. She faced them as a mother, a friend, and a valued member of a community that had been forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual dependence. The transformation was complete. Eleanor Phillips had become exactly the kind of mother Catherine Harrison had dreamed of for her children, and the babies had found exactly the kind of family Eleanor had been searching for her entire life. The Platte River stretched before them like a brown ribbon of liquid treachery, its deceptively calm surface hiding swift currents and hidden sandbars that had claimed countless lives during the westward migration. Eleanor stood at the riverbank holding Thomas while Elizabeth slept in Mary Chun's capable arms, watching Daniel and Samuel Morrison wade into the murky water to test the crossing point they'd chosen after 3 days of careful scouting. November had arrived with crisp mornings and the constant reminder that winter was racing to catch them before they could reach the mountain passes. The wagon train had made good time since recovering from the pneumonia crisis, but now they faced one of the most dangerous challenges of the entire journey, crossing a river that could rise from gentle stream to raging torrent with a single storm. The current's stronger than it looks, Daniel called back to the assembled families, water reaching his waist as he felt carefully for secure footing. We'll need to double-team the oxen and use rope guides for the children and supplies. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten as she watched the swirling water that would soon surround her wagon and the precious cargo she carried. The babies had thrived during the past month, Thomas growing chubby and content while Elizabeth developed an alert curiosity about everything around her. The thought of exposing them to the river's dangers filled Eleanor with the kind of protective fear she was still learning to manage. "Mrs. Phillips," called out Jacob Hendricks, a carpenter from Ohio whose practical skills had made him valuable during river crossings, "will modify your wagon first. Need to raise the bed and seal every gap to keep the babies dry." What followed was an intricate preparation process that revealed the wagon train's remarkable ability to solve complex problems through collective expertise. Hendricks and his teenage sons worked with Samuel Morrison to waterproof Eleanor's wagon while Martha Wellington organized the women into teams, responsible for protecting the most vulnerable members during the crossing. Mary Chun appeared at Eleanor's elbow with a bundle of oiled cloth and a concerned expression. "My family, we crossed many rivers in China before coming to America. Water spirit's very dangerous when you carry small ones. We make special protection." Eleanor watched with fascination as Mary carefully wrapped both babies in waterproof coverings that allowed them to breathe while protecting them from spray and splashing. The young woman's movements carried the confidence of someone whose family had survived similar dangers, and Eleanor found herself grateful once again for the cultural knowledge that complemented her own limited experience. Dr. Peterson appeared with his medical bag, secured in a waterproof case, and a grim expression that acknowledged the reality they all faced. "River crossings are when we lose people," he said quietly to Eleanor. "Not trying to frighten you, but you need to know that if something goes wrong, I may not be able to reach you immediately. You'll need to be prepared to handle emergencies on your own." The physician's stark honesty was becoming familiar to Eleanor, who had learned to appreciate his direct communication style over the false reassurances that other well-meaning people sometimes offered. She accepted the small medical kit he pressed into her hands, along with specific instructions for treating hypothermia, near drowning, and the various injuries that could result from wagon accidents in swift water. As dawn broke on crossing day, Eleanor found herself part of a carefully choreographed operation that demonstrated the Coleco wagon train's evolution from a collection of individual families into a coordinated survival unit. The strongest swimmers took positions at intervals across the river, ready to assist anyone who fell into the water. Ropes were stretched between trees on both banks to provide handholds for those who needed them. Extra oxen were positioned to help pull wagons through the deepest sections. Eleanor's wagon was scheduled to cross in the middle of the procession, allowing her to learn from watching the earlier crossings, while still maintaining the protection of having other families nearby. If assistance was needed, she spent the morning hours observing as the first wagons entered the water, noting how the river's current pushed against the wooden sides, and how the oxen struggled to maintain footing on the muddy-bottomed dot when the Henderson family's wagon reached mid-river. Disaster struck with terrifying suddenness. The banker's wife, who had been so critical of Mary Chun's influence, lost her footing while trying to help steady their cargo. She disappeared beneath the brown water with a scream that cut through the morning air like a knife. Eleanor watched in horror as Daniel spurred his horse into the current, diving from the saddle to search for Mrs. Henderson, while Samuel Morrison coordinated rescue efforts from the bank. For agonizing minutes, there was no sign of the missing woman, and Eleanor felt her own maternal fears multiply as she imagined similar dangers threatening her own family. When Daniel finally surfaced with Mrs. Henderson's unconscious form, the relief that swept through the assembled families was palpable. Dr. Peterson worked frantically to revive her, while her husband paced the riverbank in helpless anxiety. The woman eventually coughed up river water and regained consciousness, but the incident served as a stark reminder of how quickly tragedy could strike. "Your turn, Eleanor," Martha Wellington said gently, using the informal name that had replaced the formal Mrs. Phillips, as Eleanor's friendships within the train deepened. "Remember, the babies can sense your fear. Stay calm and they'll stay calm." Eleanor took a deep breath and climbed into her modified wagon, settling Thomas and Elizabeth in the specially constructed crib that Jacob Hendricks had designed to remain stable even if the wagon tilted significantly. Mary Chun took her position beside Eleanor, ready to help with the babies if needed, while Rebecca Foster drove the oxen with the steady competence she'd developed during weeks of trail experience. The entry into the river was less dramatic than Eleanor had anticipated. The wagon wheels found purchase on the rocky bottom, and the oxen, led by Rebecca's patient guidance, moved forward with the deliberate pace of animals that understood the importance of sure footing. Water began seeping through the floorboards, despite the waterproofing efforts, but it remained at manageable levels. The crisis came when they reached the deepest section, where the current had carved a channel that dropped the water level to nearly 4 feet. Eleanor felt the wagon tilt alarmingly as the left wheels hit the channel, and suddenly water was pouring in faster than the modifications could handle. "Hold them steady," Rebecca shouted over the noise of rushing water and creaking wood. "Don't let them panic." Eleanor found herself functioning with a clarity that surprised her, cradling both babies against her chest while Mary Chun worked frantically to adjust their waterproof wrappings. The wagon continued its dangerous tilt, threatening to overturn completely, when she heard Daniel's voice cutting through the chaos. "Rope coming across. Grab it and hold on." The line that Samuel Morrison threw from the far bank landed perfectly in Rebecca's outstretched hands. With the additional stability provided by the rope, Rebecca managed to guide the oxen through the treacherous channel and up onto the gradually rising bottom that led to the western shore. When Eleanor's wagon finally rolled onto dry ground, she found her hands shaking with delayed reaction to the danger they'd just survived. Both babies had remained remarkably calm throughout the crossing, their trust in Eleanor's protective embrace complete and unwavering. But Eleanor understood how close they'd come to disaster, and how easily this story could have had a very different ending. "Well done," Daniel said quietly, appearing at her wagon side as she climbed down on trembling legs. "You kept your head when it mattered most." Eleanor managed a weak smile, still processing the intensity of the experience. "I had good teachers and better help than I deserved." The remainder of the wagon train crossed without major incident. Though several families experienced equipment losses and everyone emerged soaked and exhausted from the ordeal. That evening's camp was subdued, with families focusing on drying clothes and equipment while processing the day's close calls. But Eleanor noticed something else emerging from the shared danger, an even stronger sense of community solidarity than had existed before. Mrs. Henderson, embarrassed by her near drowning but deeply grateful to Daniel for saving her life, approached Eleanor's campfire to offer a formal apology for her earlier hostility toward Mary Chun. "I was wrong to question your judgment about accepting help from the Chun family," she said stiffly, her pride clearly struggling with her gratitude. "Mary's knowledge and Daniel's courage probably saved all our lives today." Eleanor accepted the apology graciously, understanding the effort it had cost the proud woman to admit her mistakes publicly. More importantly, she recognized the incident as a turning point in the wagon train's social dynamics. The artificial divisions based on ethnicity, class, and circumstance were being replaced by relationships based on mutual dependence and shared survival. The evening brought an unexpected visitor when a group of Pawnee warriors appeared at the edge of their camp, their presence causing immediate tension among the families still recovering from the day's stresses. Daniel approached them with careful diplomacy, accompanied by Samuel Morrison and Dr. Peterson, while the rest of the train maintained nervous vigilance. Eleanor watched the negotiations with growing anxiety, acutely aware that her wagon, with its cargo of vulnerable infants, would be a particular target if hostilities erupted. But Mary Chun, whose family had dealt with similar tensions during their own travels, offered reassurance born of experience. "They not come to fight," Mary observed quietly, studying the warriors' posture and equipment. "They come to trade, maybe. Ask for payment to cross their land. Is business, not war." Mary's assessment proved correct. The Pawnee were indeed seeking trade goods and tribute for safe passage through their territory, but they also brought valuable information about weather conditions ahead and alternative routes that could save the wagon train weeks of travel. During the negotiations, one of the younger warriors noticed Thomas's bright hair gleaming in the firelight and approached Eleanor's wagon with obvious curiosity. Eleanor felt her protective instincts surge, but Daniel's calm demeanor suggested no immediate danger. The warrior, who appeared to be about 20 years old, spoke briefly with Daniel in a mixture of English, Pawnee, and hand signs before addressing Eleanor directly. "He says your children have strong spirits to survive the crossing today," Daniel translated. "He's offering a blessing for their continued protection during the journey ahead." Eleanor found herself moved by the unexpected gesture. She nodded her consent, and the young warrior performed a brief ceremony involving sage, smoke and quietly chanted words that seemed to invoke protection from the spirits of the land they were crossing. When the Pawnee departed the next morning, they left behind more than just safe passage agreements. Their presence had demonstrated that the dangers ahead would require not just physical courage but cultural sensitivity and diplomatic skills that complemented the survival techniques the wagon train had already developed. As they resumed their westward progress, Eleanor reflected on how the day's events had changed her understanding of what it meant to protect her children. Physical safety was obviously crucial, but equally important was ensuring they grew up understanding their place in a larger world of diverse peoples and complex relationships. Thomas and Elizabeth slept peacefully in their traveling crib, unaware that they had survived their first major test and earned the respect of both their adoptive community and the indigenous peoples whose lands they were crossing. Eleanor watched their innocent faces and felt a deep sense of pride in their resilience, along with renewed determination to prove worthy of the trust they placed in her protection. The Platte River crossing had tested every member of the wagon train, but it had also revealed the strength that came from genuine community cooperation. Eleanor was no longer an outsider trying to earn acceptance. She was a full partner in the collective enterprise of survival, with responsibilities that extended beyond her own family to the welfare of everyone around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they moved deeper into territory where winter storms and mountain passes awaited. But tonight Eleanor felt confident in the foundation of relationships and skills they had built together. The first snowflakes began falling on a gray December morning as the wagon train struggled up the rocky slopes of the Colorado Territory. Their destination still 3 treacherous mountain passes away. Eleanor pulled her wool cloak tighter around Thomas as she walked beside her wagon, her breath forming white clouds in the thin mountain air. Elizabeth rode wrapped in buffalo hide inside the wagon with Mary Chun, both of them protected from the bitter wind that cut through clothing like invisible knives. The babies had grown remarkably during their 4 months on the trail. Thomas, now nearly 6 months old, had developed into a robust infant whose bright smile charmed everyone in the wagon train, while Elizabeth had become a thoughtful baby whose serious gray eyes seemed to absorb everything around her. But their growth also meant increased needs for food, warmth, and medical care that were becoming harder to meet as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Daniel rode past Eleanor's position in the column, his cavalry coat white with accumulated snow and his face grim with the weight of decisions that could mean life or death for everyone under his command. The wagon train was behind schedule, their progress slowed by early storms and the increasing difficulty of finding adequate grass for the animals. Worse, their food supplies were running dangerously low, and hunting had become nearly impossible. In the harsh weather, "We need to talk," Daniel said quietly to Eleanor as he reined in his horse. "There's a situation developing that affects everyone, but especially the children." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with the familiar fear that had become her constant companion since entering the mountains. Every conversation with Daniel these days seemed to carry undertones of crisis, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when their survival was truly threatened. That evening, after the wagon train had made its meager 6-mile progress and established camp in a sheltered valley, Daniel called a meeting of all the adult members. Eleanor left the babies with Rebecca Foster and joined the circle of grim faces illuminated by the central campfire. "I won't sugarcoat our situation," Daniel began, his military bearing evident even in the informal setting. "We're 3 weeks behind schedule. Winter is hitting harder than normal, and our food stores are critically low. We have enough supplies to last perhaps 10 days if we ration strictly." A murmur of anxiety rippled through the assembled families. Eleanor noticed parents instinctively moving closer to their children, the protective gestures that had become second nature during months of shared danger. Samuel Morrison stepped forward with a detailed map spread on a makeshift table. "We've identified 3 possible routes forward. The northern pass is shortest but completely blocked by snow. The southern route adds 2 weeks but takes us through Ute territory that's been hostile this winter. The middle pass is our best bet, but it requires leaving behind anything that isn't absolutely essential for survival." Eleanor understood immediately what absolutely essential meant in this context. Families would have to abandon furniture, books, family heirlooms, and other possessions that represented their entire previous lives. For people who had already sacrificed so much to make this journey, the additional losses would be devastating. "How much weight do we need to shed?" asked James Mitchell, the blacksmith whose complaints had become less frequent as he recognized the genuine challenges they faced. "Half," Daniel replied bluntly. "Maybe more. Every wagon needs to carry only food, medical supplies, basic tools, and essential clothing. Everything else stays here." The silence that followed was broken by quiet sobs from several women who understood. They would have to choose between survival and the treasured possessions that connected them to their former lives. Eleanor thought of her own wagon, loaded with baby supplies, clothes, and the painting materials that had become so important to her sense of identity. Martha Wellington raised her hand tentatively. "What about the children? The babies especially. They need more than adults, not less." Dr. Peterson answered before Daniel could respond. Children are the priority, absolutely. But we need to be realistic about what we can carry. Basic clothing, medicines, food, but luxury items have to be left behind. Eleanor felt a stab of anxiety as she considered what luxury items might include. Were the art supplies Mary had taught her to use considered essential? What about the extra blankets and specialized feeding equipment that had made caring for the twins possible? As if reading her thoughts, Rebecca Foster spoke up from the edge of the circle. Mrs. Phillips needs special consideration. She's caring for infants who require equipment and supplies that adults don't need. We can't expect her to make the same cuts as families with older children. Eleanor felt grateful for Rebecca's advocacy, but she also noticed the resentful glances from some families who were already struggling with their own impossible choices. The cooperative spirit that had sustained them through previous crises was beginning to fray under the pressure of genuine scarcity. We'll work out individual allocations tomorrow, Daniel said diplomatically. Tonight, everyone should inventory their possessions and decide what they absolutely cannot live without. Remember, we're not just trying to reach California, we're trying to reach it alive. The next morning brought the most difficult day Eleanor had experienced since leaving Independence. Spread around her wagon were all her worldly possessions, sorted into piles representing essential, important, and expendable. The expendable pile was heartbreakingly large. Mary Chun worked beside her, applying the ruthless practicality her family had learned during the survival journey. This dress, very beautiful, but too heavy. This cooking pot, good quality, but we have other pot that works same. These books. Mary hesitated, knowing how much Eleanor valued the volumes of poetry and philosophy she'd brought from Virginia. They're heavy, Eleanor admitted reluctantly. And the babies can't eat poetry. As she sorted through baby supplies, Eleanor faced choices that felt impossible. Multiple sets of clothing for the twins, specialized feeding equipment, toys that stimulated their development. Every item seemed essential when she considered their role in keeping Thomas and Elizabeth healthy and happy. Rebecca appeared with her own wagon's contents spread nearby, her face showing the strain of similar decisions. I've been thinking, she said quietly. Some of my things could benefit the babies too. Maybe we could consolidate loads, share essential items between our wagons. The suggestion led to a broader conversation among the women about resource sharing. That went beyond mere survival planning. Martha Wellington contributed extra wool for baby clothing, while Mrs. Henderson offered her superior cooking equipment in exchange for help with her younger children during the difficult crossing ahead. Most surprisingly, the Chun family proposed a complete reorganization of their wagon to accommodate additional baby supplies. Our family travel light always, Mary's father explained through her translation. We carry baby things, you carry food for sharing. Everyone helps everyone. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the generosity being offered, but she also recognized the delicate social negotiations taking place. By accepting help, she was acknowledging debts that would need to be repaid through her own contributions to the community's welfare. The wagon train was evolving into something beyond a simple transportation arrangement. It was becoming a complex web of mutual obligations and shared resources. The real test of these new arrangements came 3 days later when they reached Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage between towering rock walls where the trail became so treacherous that wagons had to be lowered by rope down steep inclines. Eleanor watched in terror as the first wagon began its descent, the wooden vehicle swaying dangerously as men strained to control the ropes that prevented disaster. When Eleanor's turn came, she found herself faced with a choice that epitomized all the moral complexities of their situation. The modified crib that held Thomas and Elizabeth was too large to fit safely in the wagon during the descent, but carrying the babies separately while managing the dangerous passage seemed equally risky. Daniel appeared at her wagon with a solution that was both practical and deeply emotional. "I'll carry them," he said simply. "One at a time, using climbing techniques I learned in the army. It's the safest way to get them down." Eleanor stared at him, understanding the multiple layers of meaning in his offer. Daniel would be risking his own life to protect children he had legally relinquished, but still loved as deeply as any father. The wagon train would be risking their leader's safety for the sake of two babies who represented both hope and burden for the entire community. "Are you sure?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the canyon. "I've never been more sure of anything," Daniel replied. And Eleanor heard in his voice the echo of the promise he'd made to Catherine months ago. The descent took 4 hours of heart-stopping tension. Daniel made 3 trips down the rocky slope. First with Thomas securely strapped to his chest in a carrier Mary Chun had designed, then with Elizabeth, and finally to help guide Eleanor's lightened wagon down the treacherous path. Each trip required perfect coordination between the men controlling the ropes and Daniel's own climbing skills, with no margin for error. When the entire wagon train finally reached the bottom of Devil's Canyon intact, the relief was so intense that several people collapsed from exhaustion and accumulated stress. But they had also accomplished something significant. They had proven that their community could function under the most extreme circumstances, making life or death decisions based on collective welfare rather than individual interest. That evening, as families gathered around enlarged campfires to share the reduced rations that were now their daily norm, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed since the confident woman who had signed adoption papers in Independence. The legal mother who had worried about having proper supplies had been replaced by someone who could calculate survival priorities with ruthless efficiency, while maintaining the emotional connections that made survival worthwhile. Thomas and Elizabeth slept peacefully in their reconstructed sleeping arrangements, unaware that they had just survived one of the most dangerous passages of the entire journey. But Eleanor was acutely aware that their survival had required the coordinated efforts of dozens of people who had chosen to prioritize the welfare of 2 babies over their own comfort and safety. Dr. Peterson stopped by Eleanor's reduced campsite to check on the babies and deliver news that was both encouraging and sobering. "They're thriving despite everything," he reported. "Strong, healthy, developing normally. But the next few weeks will test everyone's limits. We're entering territory where people die from exposure, starvation, and accidents that wouldn't be fatal under normal circumstances." Eleanor nodded, understanding that the physician was preparing her for losses that seemed increasingly inevitable. The wagon train had been fortunate so far, but winter in the mountains was notorious for claiming lives even from well-prepared expeditions. As she settled into her own reduced bedding that night, Eleanor listened to the sounds of a community that had been fundamentally transformed by shared hardship. Conversations around the campfires carried the intimacy of people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable moments. Children played games that incorporated survival skills learned on the trail. Adults made plans that assumed continued cooperation and mutual support. Most importantly, Eleanor realized that her own identity had been permanently altered by the journey. She was no longer trying to prove her worthiness as a mother. She had become a mother in the deepest sense, someone whose protective instincts and practical capabilities had been forged in the crucible of genuine danger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they climbed toward the highest and most dangerous pass of their entire journey. But tonight Eleanor felt confident in the foundation of relationships and skills they had built together. The babies were safe, the community was strong, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it as a family that had chosen each other. Through the most demanding circumstances imaginable, the blizzard struck without warning on the morning they were supposed to attempt Eagle's Rest Pass, the final and most treacherous crossing before reaching the California valleys. Eleanor woke to absolute silence broken only by the muffled crying of Elizabeth, whose tiny body had grown cold during the night despite every layer of protection they could manage. Outside their shared tent, snow had piled 3 feet deep against the canvas walls, and the wind howled with a ferocity that made conversation impossible. Thomas lay beside his sister, his breathing shallow and his lips tinged with the blue that Dr. Peterson had warned Eleanor to watch for during their medical preparations. Both babies had been fighting off another respiratory infection for the past week, their small bodies struggling against the combination of high altitude, extreme cold, and the stress of constant travel. "We can't move in this," Rebecca whispered, her own breath visible in the frigid air inside their shelter. She had insisted on sharing Eleanor's tent when the temperatures dropped below freezing, understanding that caring for sick infants required more than one person's constant attention. Mary Chun pushed through the tent flap, snow swirling around her as she carried a pot of steaming liquid that smelled of ginger and medicinal herbs. "My father says storm lasts 2, maybe 3 days. Very bad. Some families already talking about ... She hesitated, unwilling to voice the unthinkable possibility. That was becoming increasingly real. Eleanor understood immediately. After months of shared hardship, the wagon train had reached the point where survival itself required choices that would have been unimaginable at the beginning of their journey. Food supplies were exhausted except for emergency rations that might last 3 more days. The animals were dying from cold and lack of adequate feed. And now, trapped in a blizzard at 9,000 feet elevation, they faced the possibility that not everyone would survive to see California. Dr. Peterson arrived shortly after Mary, his medical bag clutched against his chest and his face grim with news that Eleanor had been dreading. "I've lost 2 of the Henderson children during the night," he reported quietly. "Pneumonia and exposure. Mrs. Carlton's baby isn't expected to live through the day." Eleanor felt her world contract to the tiny space containing Thomas and Elizabeth, their precious lives hanging by threads that seemed to grow more fragile with each passing hour. She had fought so hard to keep them healthy, had invested everything in their survival, but the mathematics of the mountains were beginning to suggest that love and determination might not be enough. "What can we do?" she asked, though she suspected. She already knew the answer. Dr. Peterson examined both babies with the gentle thoroughness that had made him beloved throughout the wagon train community. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he listened to their labored breathing and noted their elevated temperatures. "They need warmth, rest, and proper nutrition," he said finally. "Things we can't provide under these conditions. If we were in California, in a proper house with adequate fuel and food, they'd recover completely. But here..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Eleanor understood that Thomas and Elizabeth were fighting a battle they couldn't win unless circumstances changed dramatically. The blizzard that trapped them was also slowly killing them, 1 degree and 1 hungry hour at a time. The crisis deepened that afternoon when Daniel called an emergency meeting of the surviving adults. Eleanor left the babies with Rebecca and Mary, wrapping herself in every layer she owned before stepping into the howling wind that threatened to knock her off her feet. The meeting took place in the largest remaining tent, where 37 people crowded together for warmth while discussing decisions that would determine who lived and who died. Daniel's usual commanding presence was subdued by exhaustion and the weight of responsibilities no human should have to bear. "We have food for 3 days, possibly 4 if we cut rations to starvation levels," Samuel Morrison reported with military precision. "Fuel for heating will last 2 days. After that, we'll be burning furniture and wagon parts to stay alive." Martha Wellington, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for the families with children, raised her hand tentatively. "What about sending a party ahead to get help? If some of us could reach the valley settlements." "In this weather, through that pass?" Daniel shook his head. "It would be suicide. No one could survive the crossing in these conditions." The unspoken Alternatives hung in the air like smoke from their meager fire. They could wait for the storm to pass and hope their supplies lasted, knowing that each day increased the likelihood of losing more children to cold and hunger. They could attempt the pass in impossible conditions, almost certainly guaranteeing casualties, but possibly saving some lives. Or they could make the choice that no parent wanted to contemplate. James Mitchell, whose rough exterior had softened considerably during their months together, spoke the words that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. Some of us ain't going to make it. We need to decide how to use what we have left to save who we can save. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she understood the implications. The wagon train was discussing triage on a human scale, determining which members had the best chances of survival and concentrating resources accordingly. Children would be prioritized over adults, the healthy over the sick, but even among the children, choices would have to be made. The babies are the most vulnerable, Dr. Peterson said with professional detachment that couldn't quite hide his emotional struggle. They require the most resources and have the lowest survival probability. From a purely practical standpoint, ... No. Eleanor's voice cut through the discussion with surprising strength. No, we don't make that choice. We don't decide that some children are worth less than others. Daniel looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration with profound sadness. Eleanor, I understand how you feel, but we may not have options. If caring for Thomas and Elizabeth means other children die, then we find another way, Eleanor replied firmly. We've solved every other impossible problem by working together. We'll solve this one too. What followed was the most intense brainstorming session of their entire journey, as exhausted and desperate people pushed past conventional thinking to find solutions that might save everyone. Mary Chun's family contributed knowledge of survival techniques used during harsh winters in northern China. Rebecca Foster suggested modifications to their shelter arrangements that could conserve heat more efficiently. Even Mrs. Henderson, still grieving her own losses, offered ideas about food preparation that could extract maximum nutrition from their dwindling supplies. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Rodriguez, the teenager who had been working with the horses since joining the train, made an observation that changed everything. The animals that are dying, he said hesitantly, unused to speaking in adult councils. We've been trying to keep them alive to pull the wagons. But if we're not moving anyway, maybe we could use them differently. Eleanor understood immediately what he was suggesting and felt her stomach turn at the implications. The oxen and horses that were dying from cold and starvation represented hundreds of pounds of meat that could sustain the human members of the expedition. It meant accepting the death of animals they'd grown attached to, and it meant abandoning any hope of continuing the journey with wagons, but it also meant survival. Daniel nodded slowly, his military experience providing context for the brutal calculus of resource allocation. We'd have to smoke the meat immediately to preserve it. And we'd be walking the rest of the way to California, carrying only what we can manage on foot. With babies, Eleanor added, thinking through the practical implications. Thomas and Elizabeth can't walk. Someone would have to carry them the entire distance. We take turns, Rebecca said immediately. All of us. We make carriers that distribute the weight, and we share the responsibility. Mary Chun was already sketching designs in the dirt floor, drawing on her family's experience with portable infant care. Chinese mothers carry babies long distances. We make special packs, very secure, very warm. Babies travel safe. Over the next 18 hours, while the blizzard continued to rage outside, the wagon train transformed itself yet again. The dying animals were slaughtered with ceremonies that honored their sacrifice, their meat processed and preserved using techniques contributed by multiple cultural traditions. Wagon parts were repurposed into carrying packs, shelter materials, and fuel for the smoking process that would preserve their salvation. Most importantly, Eleanor watched as every adult in the group took responsibility for the survival of Thomas and Elizabeth. Martha Wellington modified her own coat to create a baby carrier. Samuel Morrison crafted snowshoes sized for adults carrying extra weight. Dr. Peterson prepared medicines that could be administered during forced marches through mountain terrain. When the storm finally broke on the third day, it revealed a landscape transformed by snow and a wagon train that had evolved beyond recognition. The families who had started this journey as individual units pursuing personal dreams had become something unprecedented, a survival collective where the welfare of the most vulnerable members took precedence over everything else. Eleanor stood at the edge of their camp, holding Thomas while Elizabeth rested in Mary Chun's arms, looking up at Eagle's Rest Pass gleaming white and forbidding in the morning sun. The trail ahead would require them to climb 3,000 feet through snow that reached their waists in places, carrying everything they needed to survive while protecting two babies who couldn't contribute anything to their own rescue. "It's going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done," Daniel said quietly, joining her at the overlook. "And we're going to do it because these children represent everything we're fighting for. The future we're trying to build, the family we've become." Eleanor felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she looked at the man who had given up his biological children so they could have a mother, and who was now risking everything to ensure they reached safety. "Catherine would be proud of the father you've become," she said softly. "And she'd be amazed by the mother you've become," Daniel replied. "Leading this community, making decisions that save lives, showing everyone what it really means to protect the people you love." As the reformed expedition prepared for their final and most dangerous challenge, Eleanor marveled at the transformation that had brought them to this moment. The legal adoption that had started as a desperate solution to an impossible problem had evolved into something far more profound, a demonstration that families could be forged through choice and commitment rather than blood and circumstance. Tomorrow, they would begin the ascent that would either deliver them to California or claim their lives in the attempt. But tonight, as she settled Thomas and Elizabeth in their new portable shelter, surrounded by the adults who had pledged their lives to protect them, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace about the choices that had brought them here. They had all been broken in different ways when this journey began. Daniel by war and loss, Eleanor by childlessness and grief, the babies by the tragedy of their birth circumstances. But in choosing to care for each other through the most extreme challenges imaginable, they had created something beautiful and unbreakable, a family bound not by blood or law, but by love tested in the crucible of shared survival. The ascent of Eagle's Rest Pass began at dawn on the clearest morning they'd seen in weeks, the mountain air so thin and cold that every breath felt like swallowing ice crystals. Eleanor adjusted the revolutionary baby carrier that Mary Chun and Samuel Morrison had designed together, its intricate system of leather straps distributing Thomas's weight across her shoulders and back while keeping him warm against her body. Behind her, Rebecca Foster carried Elizabeth in a matching carrier, the two women moving in careful synchronization as they followed the line of expedition members trudging through snow that reached their knees with every step. The redesigned group looked nothing like the confident wagon train that had left Independence 5 months ago. They resembled instead a desperate band of refugees whose survival depended entirely on reaching the other side of the mountain before their strength gave out. Dr. Peterson had calculated that the crossing would require 14 hours of continuous climbing at their reduced pace, factoring in the additional weight they carried and the frequent stops needed to prevent frostbite and exhaustion. 14 hours to climb 3,000 vertical feet through conditions that killed experienced mountaineers with proper equipment. 14 hours to prove that the bonds they'd forged were stronger than they. Mathematics of survival. The first crisis came barely 2 hours into the climb when Martha Wellington collapsed in the snow, her strength depleted by months of inadequate nutrition, and the respiratory infection that had been slowly weakening her for weeks. Eleanor watched Daniel and Samuel Morrison lift the unconscious woman between them, their own faces gray with exhaustion as they contemplated the impossible arithmetic of carrying both Martha and maintaining their pace. "I can take Elizabeth too," Eleanor called out, understanding immediately what needed to happen. "For the next section, until Martha recovers." Rebecca started to protest, but Eleanor was already adjusting her carrier system to accommodate both babies. The additional weight was staggering, 30 pounds of precious cargo that transformed every step into a monumental effort. But Eleanor had discovered reserves of strength she'd never known existed. Mary Shun appeared at Eleanor's elbow with a walking stick carved from wagon wood and a grim expression of determination. "We walk together. You carry babies, I carry your pack." Chinese saying, "Single thread makes no cloth. Single tree makes no forest." What followed were the most grueling hours of Eleanor's life. Each step up the narrow trail required conscious effort as her leg muscles screamed in protest against the combination of altitude, cold, and crushing weight. The babies, sensing the stress of their situation, cried intermittently despite Eleanor's attempts to soothe them, their wails echoing off the granite walls and adding psychological pressure to the physical ordeal. But something extraordinary began happening as the expedition climbed higher. The artificial divisions that had persisted even through their months of shared hardship finally dissolved completely under the absolute necessity of collective survival. James Mitchell, the blacksmith who had complained so bitterly about delays, took turns spelling Eleanor and carrying the babies without being asked. Mrs. Henderson, despite her own grief and exhaustion, shared her carefully hoarded energy food with nursing mothers who needed extra strength. Most remarkably, Tommy Rodriguez revealed capabilities that no one had suspected during his quiet months with the expedition. The teenager who had worked with horses possessed an intuitive understanding of mountain terrain that proved invaluable as they navigated treacherous sections where a single misstep meant death. "There," Tommy called out, pointing to a series of ledges that appeared to offer an alternative route around a particularly dangerous section. "We can traverse there instead of going straight up. Longer but safer, especially with the babies." Daniel studied the route with the tactical assessment skills that had kept them alive through countless previous challenges. "You're right. It adds an hour, but it reduces the exposure risk." "Good eye, son." Eleanor noticed how naturally Daniel had used the word son when addressing Tommy, and realized that the family they'd been building extended far beyond the legal adoption of Thomas and Elizabeth. Everyone who had chosen to stay with the expedition through its transformation had become family in the deepest sense. Bound by shared sacrifice and mutual dependence at the midpoint of their climb brought both triumph and terror. They had gained enough elevation to see over the lower peaks, revealing the California valleys spread below them like a promised land of green fields and flowing rivers. But they had also reached the section of trail that local guides called the Narrows, a knife-edge ridge barely 4 feet wide with 1,000-foot drops on either side. Eleanor felt her knees go weak as she contemplated crossing that exposed section while carrying 2 babies whose safety depended entirely on her balance and sure footing. One stumble, one moment of vertigo, and 3 lives would be lost in an instant. "We rope together," Daniel announced, producing the climbing lines he'd carried since beginning the ascent. "No one crosses alone. If someone falls, the group holds them." The rope system required the most careful coordination of their entire journey. Each person was connected to the person ahead and behind, creating a human chain that could prevent individual disasters, but also meant that one person's mistake could potentially drag multiple people to their deaths. Eleanor found herself in the middle of the line, with Mary Chun ahead of her and Rebecca behind. The 3 women who had become the baby's primary caregivers, forming a protective nucleus for the most vulnerable members of their group. As they began the traverse, Eleanor focused entirely on placing one foot precisely in front of the other, ignoring the terrifying emptiness on either side. The wind that howled across the exposed ridge made balance even more treacherous, threatening to knock them sideways off the narrow trail. Eleanor felt Thomas shifting restlessly in his carrier and whispered constant reassurances, as much to calm herself as to soothe him. "Almost there," Mary Chun called back, her voice barely audible. "Over the wind. Maybe 50 more steps to safe ground." It was at step 37 that disaster struck. Rebecca Foster, exhausted from carrying Elizabeth and weakened by months of inadequate nutrition, suddenly stumbled backward. Eleanor felt the rope system jerk tight as Rebecca's weight pulled against her, threatening to drag both women and both babies over the edge. For a terrifying moment, Eleanor was suspended between two opposing forces, the rope pulling her backward toward the precipice and her own desperate grip on the rocky trail. She could hear Rebecca screaming, could feel Elizabeth's carrier pressing against her back as the younger woman fought to regain her footing. Then Tommy Rodriguez proved once again that heroes come in unexpected forms. The teenager, positioned just behind Rebecca in the rope line, somehow managed to arrest his own fall while simultaneously pulling Rebecca back onto the trail. His quick thinking and physical strength saved 4 lives in the span of seconds. When they finally reached the far side of the Narrows, Eleanor collapsed in the snow with both babies still securely attached to her body, her hands shaking with delayed reaction to how close they had come to losing everything. Rebecca was sobbing with relief and exhaustion, while Mary Chun methodically checked both carriers to ensure the babies had suffered no injury during the crisis. "They're fine," Mary reported with wonder in her voice. "Both sleeping peacefully, like nothing happened." Dr. Peterson appeared with his medical bag to examine everyone who had been involved in the near disaster, but declared them physically unharmed despite the emotional trauma. More importantly, he announced that they had completed the most dangerous section of the entire pass, with only 3 hours of steady climbing remaining to reach the summit. As they resumed their ascent, Eleanor reflected on how the near catastrophe had revealed something profound about the bonds they'd built. Rebecca had risked her life carrying Elizabeth. Tommy had saved them both without thought for his own safety, and the entire rope team had functioned as a single organism dedicated to protecting its most vulnerable members. The final approach to the summit brought challenges of a different kind. The altitude made every breath a conscious effort, and the babies began showing signs of distress from the thin air. Dr. Peterson monitored their condition carefully, warning that they needed to reach lower elevations quickly to prevent serious altitude-related complications, but they also began encountering signs that filled everyone with hope. Smoke from distant chimneys visible in the valleys below, game trails indicating abundant wildlife at lower elevations. Most incredibly, the faint sound of church bells carried on the wind from settlements that meant civilization, safety, and the end of their desperate journey. When Eleanor finally stepped onto the wind-swept summit of Eagle's Rest Pass, she felt overwhelmed by emotions too complex to fully process. Behind them lay 5 months of the most challenging experiences imaginable, marked by loss, sacrifice, and transformations that had changed everyone involved. Ahead lay the California valleys that represented not just geographical destination, but the culmination of dreams that had sustained them through every hardship. Thomas chose that moment to wake up and offer one of his brilliant smiles, his innocent joy, a stark contrast to the exhausted faces of the adults who had carried him to this impossible height. Elizabeth remained peacefully asleep, her tiny face serene and trusting as always. "We did it," Rebecca whispered, her voice filled with amazement. "We actually did it." Daniel appeared beside Eleanor, his own expression mixing exhaustion with profound satisfaction. "Catherine would be so proud," he said quietly, "not just of the babies, but of what you've all become." "What we've all become." Eleanor looked around at the group of 31 survivors who had reached the summit together, less than half the number who had started the journey, but every one of them transformed by experiences that had revealed the very best of human nature under the worst of circumstances. "This isn't the end," she said, surprising herself with the clarity of her vision. "This is the beginning. We've learned how to be a family, how to care for each other, how to choose love over fear. Now we get to use those lessons to build something beautiful in California." As they began the descent toward warmth, safety, and the promise of new beginnings, Eleanor felt Thomas's tiny hand grip her finger with absolute trust. Behind them, the mountain pass that had tested every limit of their endurance stood conquered. Ahead lay the valleys where they would plant roots, raise children, and prove that the strongest families are those forged by choice rather than chance. The ultimate test was over, but the real adventure, building a life worthy of the sacrifices that had brought them together, was just beginning. 3 years after descending from Eagle's Rest Pass, Eleanor Phillips stood on the wraparound porch of the largest house in New Haven Valley, watching Thomas and Elizabeth play in the garden. With the easy confidence of children who had never known want or fear. At nearly 4 years old, Thomas had grown into a sturdy boy whose infectious laughter could be heard across the settlement, while Elizabeth had developed into a thoughtful child whose artistic talents already showed remarkable promise. The valley that had welcomed 31 exhausted survivors now housed a thriving community of over 200 people, drawn by stories of the remarkable cooperative society that the original wagon train families had established. What had begun as desperate survival measures during their mountain crossing had evolved into a revolutionary approach to frontier settlement that challenged every assumption about how communities should be organized. "Mama Eleanor," Thomas called out, using the name that had naturally emerged as he learned to speak. "Come see the pictures Elizabeth made." Eleanor smiled at the title that had become universal throughout New Haven. She was Mama Eleanor to Thomas and Elizabeth, but also to the dozen other children whose families had integrated into their extended household structure. The legal adoption that had seemed so important in independence had become almost irrelevant compared to the practical reality of shared child rearing that had emerged from their trail experiences. She walked down to the garden where Elizabeth had set up her easel, the specialized art supplies now purchased from San Francisco merchants, rather than donated by generous strangers. The little girl's latest painting showed the entire settlement from an elevated perspective. But what struck Eleanor was how accurately Elizabeth had captured the essential character of their community, unlike traditional frontier towns organized around individual property ownership. New Haven had been designed around collective spaces and shared resources. The large houses accommodated multiple families who had chosen to remain together after reaching California. The workshops, schools, and meeting halls operated on principles of cooperation that had been tested at the crucible of survival. Most importantly, the care of children had been recognized as everyone's responsibility, creating an environment where no child was ever without protection or support. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Eleanor told Elizabeth, genuinely impressed by the sophistication of the 4-year-old's artistic vision. "You've made our home look like the special place it really is." Dr. Peterson appeared from the direction of the clinic he had established near the settlement center, his medical bag still a constant companion, but his face reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose skills were now used for healing rather than emergency survival. At 63, he had become something of a legend in California medical circles for his innovative approaches to community health care. "Eleanor, I have remarkable news," he said, settling into one of the porch chairs with obvious excitement. "I've just received correspondence from the territorial government. They want to study what we've built here as a model for other settlements. They're calling it the New Haven experiment and suggesting it might be the future of Western development." Eleanor felt a familiar mixture of pride and amazement at how far they had come from that desperate morning at the Independence auction. The legal arrangement that had saved 2 babies from an uncertain fate had grown into something that was influencing the development of an entire region. What kind of study? She asked, settling into her own chair while keeping one eye on the children playing below. Academic researchers from the University of California, government officials interested in territorial organization, and Dr. Peterson's eyes twinkled with particular pleasure, delegations from other states who want to understand how we've achieved such low infant mortality rates and high educational outcomes. The statistics were indeed remarkable. In 3 years, New Haven had not lost a single child to preventable disease or accident. Their school operated cooperatively. By all the adults with relevant knowledge had produced literacy rates that exceeded those of established eastern cities. Most significantly, their economic model based on shared resources and collective decision-making had generated prosperity that benefited everyone rather than concentrating wealth among a privileged few. Mary Chun emerged from the house carrying a toddler, her own daughter, born 2 years after their arrival in California and named Catherine in honor of the woman whose death had started their unlikely journey together. Now 25 and married to Tommy Rodriguez in a ceremony that had celebrated both Chinese and Mexican traditions, Mary had become New Haven's specialist in childhood development and cross-cultural education. The afternoon classes are ready to start, Mary announced, referring to the innovative educational program that combined academic instruction with practical skills and cultural exchange. Elizabeth, are you coming to help with the younger children's art lesson? Eleanor watched with continuing amazement as her 4-year-old daughter took on the role of assistant teacher with complete seriousness. Elizabeth's artistic talents had been recognized early, but even more impressive was her natural ability to help other children discover their own creative capabilities. She's going to be a remarkable teacher, Mary observed, settling into a third porch chair while her own daughter played with blocks at her feet. Just like her mother. The comment reminded Eleanor of how dramatically her own role had evolved since their arrival in California. What had begun as desperate motherhood during the trail journey had developed into recognition as one of New Haven's most effective leaders, someone whose judgment was trusted in matters ranging from resource allocation to conflict resolution. Rebecca Foster appeared from the direction of the workshops, her arms full of the textile samples she had been developing, using techniques learned from both Mary's family and the indigenous peoples, who had become their neighbors and trading partners. Now 31 and married to Samuel Morrison, Rebecca had established New Haven's most successful business enterprise while maintaining her role as Eleanor's closest partner in child care. The Pawnee delegation arrived this morning, Rebecca reported, settling into the group with the easy familiarity of family. They're interested in establishing formal trade agreements, but more importantly, they want to understand how we've created such peaceful relationships with all the local tribes. Eleanor smiled, remembering their terrifying first encounter with Pawnee warriors during the wagon train journey. Now those same tribal leaders sent their children to participate in New Haven's educational programs while teaching the settlement's children traditional, ecological knowledge that had proven invaluable for sustainable farming and resource management. "Where's Daniel?" Eleanor asked, realizing she hadn't seen him since morning. "At the new settlement site with the latest group of families," Mary replied. "He's been working with them all week, helping them understand our principles before they decide whether to join the community." Daniel Harrison had become New Haven's unofficial ambassador to the outside world, traveling throughout California to share their experiences and help other communities adopt similar cooperative approaches. His military background provided credibility with skeptical authorities, while his personal transformation from bitter veteran to community builder offered hope to others struggling with war's aftermath. More importantly, Daniel had found peace with his complex relationship to Thomas and Elizabeth. He remained their Papa Daniel, Not their father in any legal sense, but the man who had chosen their mother and continued to play a protective role in their lives. The children understood intuitively that they had been blessed with multiple adults who loved them unconditionally, making questions about biological parentage seem irrelevant. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A wagon train leader's desperate decision had connected a grieving widower with an infertile woman, creating the foundation for a family that had grown to encompass an entire community. The children who had once been treated like property now lived in unprecedented security and opportunity. Thomas was already showing leadership qualities that reminded everyone of Daniel's military competence, while Elizabeth's artistic gifts were being nurtured in ways that would have been impossible in traditional frontier society. But perhaps most remarkably, every adult who had survived the journey to California had discovered purposes and capabilities they had never known they possessed. Mary Chun had become a respected educator whose innovations were being adopted throughout the territory. Rebecca Foster had evolved from traumatized widow to successful entrepreneur and community leader. Dr. Peterson had pioneered medical approaches that were saving lives across the region. Even the most unlikely transformations had proven sustainable. James Mitchell, the blacksmith who had complained so bitterly about delays, had become New Haven's master craftsman and one of its most generous community supporters. Mrs. Henderson, despite losing 2 children during the mountain crossing, had channeled her grief into passionate advocacy for child welfare that had influenced territorial legislation. As evening approached, the extended family gathered for their daily communal meal, a tradition that had evolved from the necessity of shared cooking during the trail journey. Eleanor looked around the long table at faces that represented every background and experience imaginable, united by their commitment to proving that cooperation could triumph over competition. "I have an announcement," Daniel said as the meal concluded, his expression carrying the mixture of excitement and nervousness that Eleanor had learned to associate with important news. "The territorial governor has officially invited us to send representatives to the Constitutional Convention. They want New Haven's voice included as California applies for statehood." The implications were staggering. Their small experimental community would have the opportunity to influence the fundamental structure of an entire state's government, possibly spreading their innovations throughout the American West. "Who would represent us?" Rebecca asked, though Eleanor suspected she already knew the answer. "The community will decide democratically, as always," Daniel replied. But the governor specifically requested that Eleanor be included in any delegation. Her work with children's welfare and cross-cultural cooperation has gained attention throughout the territory. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. 3 years ago, she had been a childless widow with no particular purpose beyond her own grief. Now she was being invited to help shape the future of American expansion and settlement. "I can't do it alone," she said finally. "If I go, I need Mary and Rebecca with me. This community's success comes from all of us working together, not from individual leadership." The response was immediate and unanimous. Every adult around the table voiced support for a delegation that would represent New Haven's collaborative principles rather than traditional hierarchical authority. As the evening wound down and families began settling their children for sleep, Eleanor found herself standing once again on the porch where she had watched Thomas and Elizabeth play earlier in the day. But now she was joined by Daniel, both of them contemplating the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever wonder what Catherine would think?" Eleanor asked, watching the last light fade from the valley that had become their promised land. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then smiled with genuine peace. "I think she'd be amazed by the children you've raised, proud of the community we've built, and grateful that her death led to something so much larger than any of us could have imagined." Eleanor nodded, understanding that their story had become something beyond personal healing or individual success. They had proven that broken people could create unbroken communities, that families could be forged through choice rather than chance, and that love tested in the crucible of survival could transform not just individuals but entire societies. Inside the house, Thomas and Elizabeth slept peacefully in bed, surrounded by the security of dozens of adults who had chosen to love and protect them. Outside, the settlement of New Haven stood as a beacon of hope in a world too often divided by fear and competition. The wagon train that had left Independence with individual dreams of California gold had discovered something far more valuable: the knowledge that human beings were capable of creating heaven on earth when they chose cooperation over conflict, love over fear, and shared purpose over individual ambition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as their innovative community faced the complexities of statehood and expansion. But tonight Eleanor Phillips felt complete satisfaction in the knowledge that every choice she had made, from that first desperate decision to adopt 2 abandoned babies to this moment of contemplating their community's national influence, had been guided by love rather than fear. The broken soldier, the infertile woman, and the orphan twins had found each other in the darkness of desperate circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful together. Their legacy would endure not just in the children they had raised, but in the proof they had offered that humanity's greatest strength lay in its capacity for transforming individual wounds into collective wisdom, personal loss into shared hope, and desperate survival into joyful thriving. In the end, they had all been saved, not by changing their circumstances, but by choosing to love each other through whatever circumstances they faced together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.